Gaat u zitten. Please sit down. My name is Berend Prakke. I'm Vice Dean of the Faculty of Medicine. On behalf of the Board of Directors of the University of Utrecht and the Board of Directors of the University Medical Center Utrecht, it's a great honor for me to welcome you today on this special academic occasion. The farewell speech, although he doesn't like to have it called that way, the farewell speech of Professor Olle and Cate, entitled Health Profession Education Retrospective and Prospective. Professor ten Cate studied medicine in Amsterdam and got his PhD in 1986 at the University of Maastricht. But we got the best out of him. In 1999, he was appointed as professor at the University of Utrecht. For his incredible amount of work, he received many national and international awards, among which even a Royal Award in 2020, and just recently, you might have missed it, the Harman Tiddens penning, which is a very special penning because medal. It was named after after Harman Tiddens, who was his predecessor at Utrecht, at UMC Utrecht, but 30 years before him. Olle ten Cate has played a very important role in medical education. That's clear for everyone who was here. We are very grateful for him for his great services for UMCU and medical education in general. And I would like to explicitly thank here his family, his wife, and his son for the fact that they, as a team, also entrusted us the services of Olle ten Cate. After the speech of Olle ten Cate, there will be the possibility to congratulate him. But after leaving the room, I would like to ask you to first let the cortege and the people in the first rows join him. Enough for now. I'm happily giving the words to Professor Olle ten Cate.
Dear friends and colleagues, and I apologize for doing this in English, but I'll try to do it in a way that even the Dutch would understand. Dear friends, dear colleagues, I'm more than delighted to see you here in this, at this moment of, I would say, the completion of the Professoriate. And I don't like to call this a farewell lecture that people have understood because I'm not saying farewell to many, many of you. So let's look at the title of my presentation. It says, Health Professions Education Retrospective and Prospective. And during the lecture, I'm sure you will get a deeper understanding of those words. A few of you in the audience might get a glimpse already where that direction will be. But I want to start by saying that I am, after over 40 years, very grateful to have been working in a domain that is so important for society. And there's a special reason for that. And that is because we are talking about two pillars of society. One pillar of society is education. We have all nations in the world, the Netherlands and any other country, has the obligation to make sure that their population is educated well in doing things that they would like to do, to stimulate their careers, and that is what universities are for. At the same time, we also, in this domain, work in a healthcare setting. So the healthcare setting and the universities have different obligations. So healthcare as a pillar of society must make sure that health provision is done up to standards. We must make sure as medical education that we don't only nourish the students that we have, but also protect our future patient population with everyone that receives a license from our education. So that is why throughout this lecture, and I'll keep the logos of the university and University Medical Center throughout all the slides of this lecture. Those are the two important pillars. And let me give you just a brief glimpse of where I'm heading for. If you look at these things, look at the word health in blue, a hospital in blue, University Medical Center with a blue ring, and prospective. And prospective really means we're actually delivering graduates from our schools that will be working in healthcare. We cannot avoid, or we cannot actually, we have to look at what they are going to do in the future. Uh, Retrospective is actually looking back. Looking back, you could say at the end of university training, we just look at what people have done, and that is a retrospective view. The university makes sure that everybody meets the university standards, but that's not the same as allowing them to start doing with something with patients. So the agenda for now is I will start by looking back, and I will end by looking forward. I will do that both as you had expected when you read the title, retrospective and prospective, about medical education, and then the pièce de résistance of this piece will be a new concept, a new way of looking at medical competence as a multi-layered construct, and I'll explain all of this. To start a little bit with history, the building where you are now is actually used for ceremonial happenings like this, also as a concert hall. But when it was built in 1567, it was actually a healthcare facility. It was for the feeble and the diseased, notably those people suffering from smallpox. And on about 50 minutes walk from here is where the university was established, just a few decades after that. So you can see here on the right side, the Dome Tower is very close to the university, the ancient university buildings. And if you have time to walk around, if you're not familiar in Utrecht, I would invite you to do that, to look at that. But again, we have these two pillars of society, healthcare and education. So let's start a little bit with a personal retrospection. This picture that you can see reflects a little bit of my personal history. And I know there are at least two people, maybe even more, who recognize this environment. And I can see one of them smiling when I look here in the audience. It is the clinical lecture hall in one of the academic hospitals of the University of Amsterdam that was still operated until 1981. This picture, however, is from 1990. But this is exactly the place where I was trained and where people like Siska Yoon was trained, or Cor Kalkman, who were in the audience. So they will recognize this too. So the University of Amsterdam, when I went to medical school, it felt like medical education was all carved in stone. There's one way to do this. Everybody has to meet the same standards. It starts with anatomy, then all sorts of theory, biochemistry, and everything. That is the way physicians must be trained. And I must say, this probably in many other countries, it's still the same. And I didn't have an idea that there was space to change anything until I accepted a job after I have my master's degree in medicine to work at the University of Amsterdam. This is the new building. The old buildings were abandoned. The new building was erected early 1980s. And there suddenly I was plunged actually in a group that radically changed the curriculum, even more radical than some other people might even realize that what happened in Amsterdam at that time. We had new approaches in the 1980s. We had actually, I looked at it, and one of my first tasks is to actually write educational objectives. We didn't have that, no educational objectives. So that was new. Student-centered education, horizontal integration between basic sciences. Electives were introduced. They didn't have that. Small group workshops were introduced. A modular curriculum was created. We started working with peer teaching models. Program evaluation was something new too. So that happened in the 1980s, and I have been working there for about 20 years. So in the 1990s, we started doing different things. We looked at clinical education. A lot of clinical education was restructured, and we collaborated with another university in Amsterdam. Actually, we look at many things at the curriculum, but also clinical education. Until I got this phone call from Theo Vaughan. Is he in the audience? He was planning to be. Anyway, he was actually starting a new curriculum in Utrecht, and he said, won't you come to Utrecht and then assist us with thinking about a new curriculum? So that's when it started 24 years ago. So this is a picture of the same position that I'm in now, but then it was for the inauguration of that moment. And then many things happened in Utrecht. So a lot of curriculum development. Here's a new building that was actually built in 2005. But in that new building, many, many, many things happened. And I'm not going into all details. I'll mention some, but there's a lot that we actually documented in papers in the literature, helping others to think just about the way of thinking of curriculum development. But what we did actually is after we established in 2005, when the new building was there, we also established a center for research and development on a professional level in education at UMCU. So what we did there is a lot of curriculum development, a lot of educational technology development, much was invested in that domain. Faculty development, we heard about that, those who were in the symposium heard about that. And mandatory teaching qualification was something that was unique in Utrecht and quickly actually also in the medical school. A teaching scholars program was for advanced faculty members, and I'm skipping one thing, peer teaching, and also a student teaching qualification. When I was in Glasgow just this past week, I told people when I was actually chairing a session on peer teaching that all our students in this university have a mandatory teacher training to prepare them for their future, because they will be teaching junior medical graduates, and it will also benefit their patient care. So that's also what happened. We established an international medical educators exchange program that you've heard about in the previous sessions. So we started a collaborative doctoral program with the University of California in San Francisco. We had our international course on entrustable professional activities. I'll come back to that complex word. And meanwhile, we did a lot of research, publications. We had many PhD graduates. And also, we started working in postgraduate medical training. Now, you have to understand, for those who are a little bit unfamiliar with that. So you have undergraduate medical education, what we call the medical school, 6 years in the Netherlands, basically. And then after that, people become specialists. So we call that postgraduate medical education. And I have become very, very active in postgraduate medical education on a national level. So let me start saying a little bit about postgraduate medical education, because it is a very good example of what we are doing and where we're coming from. The birth of postgraduate medical education has been pinpointed in around 1920. And before that time, you have to realize that in the 19th century, the medical doctors were, I would say, 90% of medical doctors just were educated in medicine, had a license, and were able or considered able to practice across the board about any sort of patient care. No specialty was actually an exception. So there were some people at Johns Hopkins University, and most famous people, some of the educators in the audience will recognize William Osler's name. Also, William Halstead has been very significant as a surgeon. The two of them sat together and said, we really have to establish something that is formal. And what is that formality? One thing is they said, well, we need to have an intern year. Means every medical graduate needs to work 1 year in practice, because otherwise we don't think it is justified to give them a license to practice medicine. But for those who are interested more deeply, there's a multi-year period starting in surgery and medicine as a resident or house officer under guidance. And I've always been puzzled by the word resident. You know what the word resident really means? Resident is somebody who lives somewhere. And living in the hospital was actually the paradigm for residency training. Living in the hospital, doing clinical and administration work, because there's so much work that those people like Osler and Halstead didn't have time to do that. So they recruited people and said, well, why don't you just work for us for a fixed number of years. We will agree with that, like 3 years or 4 years, and then call you a specialist. That's how it started in 1920. And that model has been taken. And I'm sure Osler and Hallstatt, they're still celebrated as unique, high quality educators. But it was also used in other universities. And those other universities, we didn't really know about that quality. So after a long time, and there's many, many things that I'm not going into detailing, but around 2000, something new happened. And that new was called competency-based medical education. Competency-based residency training was considered the next advance in graduate education. And one of my dear colleagues, Carol Caraccio, at that time, and I wasn't familiar with her work yet, that's the first paper that I read of her. Carol Caraccio said, we're shifting paradigms. You know why? Let me explain that. I'm not going into Flexner, but shifting paradigms really means if you would say there's a fixed period of 3 years or a fixed period of 4 years, but depending on the specialty, if you fix that from the very beginning, at the end of that period, is everybody equal? Or should we have actually established there could be differences between individuals? And I'll show you that in a few slides next. But the paradigm shift is moving away from a fixed time with variable outcomes. So you have 1,000 people, students, are they all meeting standards? To maybe fixed outcomes, but then you have to think you might need variable time. Some people could do that in 3 years. Maybe others would need 5 years. So we have to think somewhat differently and really look at what people can do instead of just saying after 3 years, we'll sign off for you. So competency-based medical education is actually answering the question, when a doctor is competent enough, when is a doctor competent enough to work without supervision? So you understand, and if you're a patient, you hope that if you're ever seeing residents, or in the Dutch they are called AJOS or assistent, is that doctor competent enough to do the work that he does with you as a patient? Does that person deserve a license to practice at any time? And the question then is that time the same for all residents? Or could there be any differences here? So one of our PhD students, Cecile Rappersloot in the radiology department, actually used these data. And these data it's interesting to look at them. So what our radiology residents have been doing is taking every 6 months a comprehensive test of radiology. And you can see over 5 years period time from postgraduate year 1 to postgraduate year 5, that they increase in their knowledge and skills, and which is actually perfect. At the same time, now look carefully at this graph. What do you see as most salient? And that is the difference between the individuals. Just take one test and you could see there's a huge range. Some people are really high in that range. Others are low in that range. Should we all accept them and just say after 5 years, oh, you're done? You can be a radiologist. Or look at this one. This is a publication for about 10 years ago among gastroenterologists. So this is about an activity called colonoscopy, or in Dutch, coloscopy. Many students, people have had that. And how many times do you need to do that under supervision before you are qualified to do that without supervision? This study actually shows that some people could do that in 100 attempts under supervision. It's quite a number, but they're really needed, but 100 attempts. But others might need 200 attempts under supervision before they're ready to work unsupervised, or 300 attempts. So what you can see, there's a huge individual difference. Why are we saying to everyone, this time is up, are you ready or not? We are going to sign you off. So with somebody else, Gerson Jonke, who is also in the audience, and some co-authors who are also in the audience, we did an interview study among European program directors for anesthesiology training. And one of the questions in that interview was actually, are you really confident with everyone you sign off for completion of training? And what we find is that usually they would be a little hesitant and say, well, time is up and I don't know how to document that. We're signing off anyway. They may not be accepted if they apply for a job in our own department. But anyway, they finish training. So now think of this question. And some of you, probably be a minority, but some of you are in a position of being a program director. And if I would ask you, have you ever personally signed off for completion of a program or a rotation? A rotation was a shorter period of time, where you were not fully confident that the learner had met critical objectives. I have asked this question several times in the past 2 years for different audiences like this, using uh, devices to gather their opinions about that. This is what we find. So at least 60%, more than that, can remember at least a few times that they have personally signed off for a learner they would not hire in their own department, and they would not probably send their own family members to. They were not confident that this person has met critical objectives. So if we think of that, and we're 20 years after the shifting paradigm, we're still moving in that direction. We're still doing a lot of work, and those who went to Glasgow in the past days for the big medical education conference will acknowledge that we're still doing a lot of work there. So across time, there is promise, pearls, problems, and progress of competency-based education. And if I would cite Carol Caraccio here, in a recent paper just a few months ago, and Perspectives in Medical Education, we're always proud of that journal because it's basically a Dutch journal, but it's in English language. Carol Caraccio, and I know, Carol, you are watching this on a live stream. She actually said, we're not there yet. So we have to dismantle that idea of fixed time and variable outcome. We cannot accept variable outcomes. So abandoning that idea of ready or not, here they come, that's way overdue. We have to work on that. So, but we have to realize that it's not easy to do that. It is very simple. If you are a program director or supervisor to say, well, it's about time for you to finish the training, let's sign you off. But now we're asking, independent of the time, does that person really meet all the critical objectives that we think are important to be a specialist? That's a much more difficult question. So there's enhanced requirements if we really move to a competency-based, time-variable education system. That's important to think about that. So we need standards. We need standards because of competence, because there's a benchmark for teaching, benchmark for training and assessment. But we also have to think, it's not easy to define those standards. Are those standards the same as 10 years, 20 years ago, or the same as 20 years from now? Are those standards the same in Utrecht or Sao Paulo or Cape Town? Or how should we actually determine when professionals are competent? And more generally, are professionals who pass their exams also the same people that we should be trusting and allowing to go to practice? Now look at this. And here we come back to those words of retrospective and prospective. If you think of assessment of clinical competence, traditionally, we have a stance that's taken in most of education, primary education, secondary education, much of higher education. We're just watching what people do. We say, we'll give you assignments. If you do them well, okay, well, you get a high score. If you pass your written tests, you'll get a high score. And we have no reasons to stop you doing this. So that is a retrospective look. We look at your history as a medical student or history as a student in general. Now, as medical educators, we have another obligation. We have that obligation of a gatekeeper for the quality of healthcare. It's not justified to say to our learners, you're ready to, if you don't really believe they are ready. So the other question, that's the prospective question, is the student really ready to assume the expected future responsibilities? And I'm not saying that's an easy question, but it's a question that you really have to address. And we're busy with that. There are several studies, multiple studies that we're doing around the world actually to look at that. And then look at that word competence. So the word competent is an interesting word. And we use that because we say, well, a person is competent. Usually we say that they're able to do something. but are they also permitted to do something? And permitted is the healthcare side, able is the university side. So, and I'm fortunate. So in my library at home, I have a Latin Dutch dictionary from, I have to look at it, from 1738. It's a really an antique one. And I just a few weeks ago, I looked up the word competence. Competence. So it's called Ponza Ethinore, and for those who have studied Latin will understand that means the aid for the dummies, because people were expected to know all that by heart, but we need a dictionary. So the dictionary was the Ponza Ethinore. But then if you look at the word competence here, um, it includes both ability and legal right. So, or in Dutch we would say bevoegd en bekwaam. So it has bevoegdheid en bekwaamheid. And those who have a legal background will recognize that from legislation. But also in medicine, we have the same thing. So with the word competent, we have to look prospectively, but also retrospectively, or the other way around. So having said all that, let's go to the pièce de résistance. I would like to talk with you now about a somewhat new conceptualization of what medical competence is. The new conceptualization is actually looking at layers of competence to advance the discussion on standards of competence. So we just recently, a few weeks ago, published this paper, and I have to acknowledge many of our collaborators that are on the reference here. You can see, and those of you who are familiar with medical education will recognize all these names, big names in medical education. But also, Stephen Billett has really carefully looked at manuscripts. Tevezepramyan had discussions with Anastasia Kudisheva, who's now in Germany, but actually studied here with a Russian background, and I'll come back to that. Also, helped me think about these concepts. So if we think of layers of medical competence, the core layer can be called canonical competence. That's a word that Stephen Billett used in Australia. And what you actually say of that is it is competence that is independent of the context independent knowledge and skills. So around that is a layer that you could call contextual competence. And that is the ability to apply your knowledge. You could be tested on knowledge, but you have to apply it in patient care, with patients, working with a team, in a hospital setting, or in an outpatient clinic setting. So you have to adapt to contextual diversity. And the word adaptation, those who were at the symposium this afternoon recognize that word too. Finally, and this is, I would say, probably the most unusual layer, but I would argue that on top of that layer, there's something that you could call personalized competence. And that is the individuality of the art of patient care. And I need some time to explain that. But again, so canonical novels, think of Gray's Anatomy, think of Harrison's Internal Medicine. Here, contextual competence, think of local protocols that are used in this hospital or that hospital, or actually interacting with patients, or working in a team that is quite diverse. Now, personalized competence actually forces us to think about the differences of all healthcare professionals. We are not a machine. We're not producing people who are identical. We are producing people who are all different and also have individuality. And that is, you could call that the art of patient care. So if you see that as layers, look at this in this way. So I have actually created somewhat of a temporal framework here, starting with preclinical education, then clinical education, then postgraduate specialty training, and then post-certification. There's a lot of things happening after postgraduate training. So one is canonical competence, dark blue, and then contextual competence and personal competence. Let's say a few things about that first layer. So competence as a canonical knowledge and skill is derived from the Greek word of canon. And canon is a word that's been used in like in Catholic law, rules, principle, Bible books, etc. But it's basically the established body of work, more or less undisputed. So canonical knowledge is what everybody should know. And canonical competence would be the medicine that should be kind of undisputed. And as a disclaimer, I would say undisputed in 2023. But standards then of that canonical competence should actually be useful across context and schools. And a mechanism should be in place to regularly update the canon with corrections, with additions, with evolving priorities. And assessment, I believe, in that core element should and also can be reliable and valid. That are words that we'll talk about a lot if we talk about workplace-based assessment. But I think for canonical knowledge and skills, we can probably do that. So contextual competence is the next. So this brilliant paper by Pim Tönnies, who is actually here, sitting all the audience, talks about contextual competence too. And they did a study just looking at what are the experiences of residencies and specialty training when they are in a new context. They're looking around, they have to continuously move between using their canonical knowledge and skills and recognize where and when contextual differences require new learning and adaptations. So, contextual competence is the ability to apply that canonical knowledge and skills in clinical contexts, and in fact, in different and varying contexts, with regards to rules, habits, procedures, team members, local protocols. Layer two standards of competence cannot be absolute, cannot always work across contexts. They must be locally interpreted and comply with local conditions. Then the assessment should regard, and I believe this strongly, should regard their readiness to be entrusted with healthcare tasks. So teachers should foster a progressive autonomy of learners in that phase. Autonomy in the permission to act in healthcare, in patient care. And to go a little bit deeper on that word entrust, think of a dictionary explanation. The dictionary, Oxford Dictionary, says to assign the responsibility for something valued to a person or an organization, or to put one's trust in a person, organization, with regard to a particular task or responsibility. And that could be a task. It could also be a person. Could also be a patient. Could also be a baby. And an interesting anecdote. 2 days ago, and I had to think about that. I had a dinner sitting across some people from Brazil. They're actually both here, and also some people from Portugal. And the lady from Portugal was a medical educator, but she had a small child, 6 months old, and she wanted to start eating. So, and they didn't know each other. Those two couples did not know each other. So then the Brazil lady stood up and said, if you want, I can take care of her. And then she added to that, I am a pediatrician. So, but she did that, and I observed that. And that is putting something into the care and trusting your baby to something. So I had to think about that because of this picture. Now, remember, those who were at the symposium, we talked about the centaur Chiron. And the centaur Chiron was entrusted by Apollo with the education of his son Asclepius in the art of medicine. That's what happened. So here you can see Asclepius when he was actually handed over, just what I saw 2 days ago, to the centaur Chiron. And here's Asclepius, who grew up, and we all know Asclepius. And if you don't know him, you will recognize the rod and the snake that is a symbol of medicine, just about universal. So that is layer 2A, the contextual layer 2, the contextual competence, and there are some proposed central concepts in that. And as I said, entrustable professional activities and entrustment decision making can be central in that. I'm not saying must be, I say can be, and I think many people would agree. But let me just explain that word because those who were at the symposium have heard that many times, and you may not all know what that is. An entrustable professional activity is an activity that you ask a trainee to do once you're sure that they have the competence to do that, and you're sure that you are willing to step back and have that person do it alone. So it's a central part of medical education. This is what happens all the time. We have to do that. undergraduate training, postgraduate training. So it is a unit of professional practice. And you can think of that as a task or a responsibility that can be fully entrusted to a trainee once he or she has demonstrated the necessary competence to execute that activity unsupervised. And the purpose to do that is actually to create an educational system of competency-based education by stepwise and safe engagement of trainees in clinical practice with progressive autonomy. So coming back on that word competence, and we have seen the word competent is an interesting word. So we already have seen it has a legal and an ability connotation, but you could also define it in an operational way. One way to say that is actually to say when a professional activity is mastered at a threshold level of development that permits trust in a learner to act unsupervised. It's a very simple definition, but if you think of it, it is a stage in a developmental continuum. We should not pretend in undergraduate or postgraduate training that we are creating masters who know everything. They have to have a threshold that we're all confident in, and then they will develop further. So if you think of that same graph, we've seen that graph with the radiologists and with others. There's a lot of literature about this. And you superimpose a well-known framework of development from novice, advanced, beginner, competent, proficient, and expert. You could just think of training this way. So that is the thresholds after competent. Being competent means you are now able to do things, but you should also now be allowed by us to do things. So that is the moment of readiness for unsupervised practice. Now that relates to EPAs too. Let's just think of a very simple EPA that everybody will understand: driving a car. So you need to be trained to drive a car, right? At a certain point, providing a driver's license means from now on, this moment on, you're allowed to do this by yourself because we have observed you enough to make sure that you can get that license. So that is really an entrustment decision. And if you don't think of it, it is really an entrustment decision. And we hope we always make that decision in the right way. So that is an EPA. But you could also think of EPAs in healthcare, and some things are more easy than other things. Or some things you would say, well, we're not even starting to train people in the first day of training. Could be later or something very easy. And if you draw that threshold line of competence, you can easily see that's not on the last day of training when they should be qualified or have the ability to do things. There could be different moments across training that a person is ready for unsupervised practice in that domain, in that task. And if you keep on doing that, you could even qualify a person, and we do that more and more, like formally qualify for making an entrustment decision. But if you don't practice any afterwards, of course you have to lose that qualification. We should lose that. So it could be also somewhat dynamic after training. And if you think of it, there could also be EPAs that you would add. You were not trained in that when you had graduated, but there could be things that you add to your portfolio. Could be a dynamic portfolio. And if we talked about unsupervised or supervised, but of course, every supervisor knows there's shades of supervision. Usually we say to learners in an early stage, you can come and watch, come into the healthcare, just look what we're doing here in the operation room or somewhere else. We're not allowing you to do anything, but you start observing. Now you can start doing something yourself, but we need to stand next to you. Because we call that direct supervision, proactive direct supervision. But if you've done well for a number of times, you would say, well, maybe you're ready now for indirect supervision, which really means you're alone with the patient. We will be in the hospital. If you really need us, you can get us and just call us if you need us. But here, this is indirect supervision. And finally, of course, if you advanced enough, you could start doing unsupervised practice, which means there's not somebody else in the hospital who can take over. The most of you could do is have a phone call with someone and then say, can you give me some advice? But you have to do it. And there's not somebody within 10 minutes to help you out with a problem. So here's what we're focusing on in training. And then afterwards, if you ever move further, of course, you will become in that position of being a supervisor for junior learners. So here, look at that moment here. So it's a summative decision for unsupervised practice at level 4. Level 4 means ready for unsupervised practice. If you make that decision seriously, it means there is still a period in training. And that makes our healthcare safer. That if we do that and we don't wait until the end of training, say, now you're licensed and go on, leave our program and go practice somewhere else, we don't see you working. We have to see our own learners working with full responsibility. We have to create a situation that we can do that. So that was all layer 2. Oh, let me just summarize. Just summary that you would understand. So medical students can be trusted to make small contributions to healthcare, starting inserting an IV, maybe sometimes some sort of injection or measuring blood pressure, things that do not have to be checked. And if you are in clinical training further, you may gradually build a portfolio with larger and broader EPAs. And specialists can develop a scope of practice. A scope of practice really means at any point in time, even if it's 10 years after your specialty training, we want to make sure that you're up to skills with whatever you do now. And if you have not practiced this EPA, we should not acknowledge that. If you've added EPAs, we should see that in your professional portfolio. So now, layer 3, you were waiting for layer 3, personalized confidence, I know. So this triggered me. One of the publications triggered me was a publication by Travis Apremian. He actually wrote in this paper about surgeons in training. And those surgeons in training move from one OR to a different OR. They actually look at different supervisors. They don't have one supervisor, they have several supervisors. And every time they are kind of rediscovering that expert physicians develop their own way of doing things. They're not identical. And there is a distinction between, and that's difficult for them, what is a principle that is non-negotiable? You always have to do it this way. But what is a preference? What is it? And some surgeons wouldn't even know themselves exactly what the distinction between that preference and principle is. They don't always look at each other in the OR. So that is something what learners need to learn. That there is some procedural variations that are negotiable and others are not. So personalized competence is actually that layer of competence that gives a personal style of patient care, that makes physicians unique in their excellence and turns the science of healthcare somewhat into the art of healthcare. So if you think of other domains, and of course artists come to mind first if you talk about art, but think about actors, architects, restaurant chefs, industrial designers, and other professions. I could go on and on. They usually, if you look at them, if they're very good, they meet important standards of knowledge and skills. They know exactly how to do it. On top of that, they are valued most for their unique style of doing things. Not so much for what everybody else also does, but also for their unique style of working. So, and the key concept to understand this is the concept of Perishivine. That's a new word. And a competence stemming from Perishivine, I'll explain that. So if I put this picture up, some people might recognize. Anyone? Just shout from somewhere. I heard it. I think I heard it. Vygotsky. Yeah. This is Lev Vygotsky, a Russian, Jewish Russian educational psychologist. He died many years ago, but he has given a huge legacy. And what we know most of him, and Marika has already alluded to it, something that's called the zone of proximal development, but also things like cultural historical activity. He has been working in social constructivism. Anyway, that's what we know him from. Hardly anybody knows about this part of him. So it's called Perishivine. Now, Perishivine, Emotion, Subjectivity is a recent book about all his work in that domain. And Perishivine actually combines experience with emotion and subjectivity. You will be able to get the reference if you're really truly interested. Now, what is Perishivine? And some people, if you read the literature, say, well, it's difficult to define that. And I have several conversations with Anastasia Kurisheva, who was a PhD student in our center, but who was also trained at the Moscow State University for her psychology. So she could explain that to me pretty well. But this is also basically based on the literature. It is the subjectivity that makes individuals unique in their creative performance, being the resultant of the combined cognitive and emotional experience built across a lifetime, integrated in the long term memory, as I would say, because I think that is important to understand, and informing one's frame of reference in viewing the world, the way that you look at things. It is just anything in the world, but also healthcare. So, pedagogy wine of one person can never be fully understood by other people because you don't have that same experiences. So, how does this explain how vocational competence could be become an art? Just think of you're practicing things, and of course, you learn to do things that you have a teacher, and your teacher shows you how to do things, and then if the and it becomes more sophisticated. Here's an example of somebody who actually creates like a vase, which is just be used for flowers or for wine, maybe. But you could start thinking there's a little bit of art in here, right? Or look at this. This is Stradivari. Stradivari didn't have a factory. Are his instruments that he built unique, or are they a piece of art? Are they different from what other violin builders actually created? Probably yes. So, and then think of this. So, this is the Surgical Guild of Amsterdam, was painted by Nicolaas Maas. And you can see what he did. He did his best to make sure that everybody was, their faces were, so like a photograph, if you want to be on the picture, you have to look at the right way. Maybe you could make it a little nicer than it's in practice. So that's a craft. You could say it's a craft. Would we now call that a craft? No, if you look at what people pay for this is all art. People call this art. And now, if we go into art a little more deeply and see how people develop across a lifetime, you may not be familiar with Picasso's work very much. But if you look at his early work, you could see he was a very skilled, realistic painter. This is a painter in 1897, and there's another painter more towards the end of his life. Is totally different. But he has this foundation of skill to actually create the art that is personal for him. And you could actually follow him across times. If you could see from the very realistic, a little bit less realistic, and then 10 years later or 7 years later, it's even more like more art in the way that we know Picasso, and finally ending up with something that is that some people say, well, a kid could do that also. But it's also built across a lifetime based on things that were informed by his experiences, by his emotions, and his own development. And it reminds a little bit of other educators or other theorists, I would say. There's somebody else who might be worth mentioning, that is Abraham Maslow. And he was a Jewish Ukrainian psychologist who moved to the United States. And he created a pyramid that's really famous. And many of you will have heard of that pyramid, a pyramid of conditions that must be met to develop in a certain direction. And I know in the literature, there's a literature about that, but it's that would say, well, you could look at that differently. But I think the model in itself is really nice. So people would say you need physiological needs be met, and then safety needs must be met, and then needs for belonging and love you need to be met before you can start even thinking of esteem. And everybody has a little bit need for esteem. So, and then there's cognitive satisfaction that you want. You want to understand the world. You want to understand things. And then there's aesthetic. And then he comes to self-actualization and transcendence. So self-actualization is nicely formulated by Maslow. It is the desire for self-fulfillment to become actualized in what one is personal, potentially, varying greatly from person to person, and being creative. And I like this sentence, relatively unfrightened by the unknown. If you think of it, relatively unfrightened by the unknown. If you are an experienced physician and you went through all those stages and you feel kind of confident about yourself, that is the moment where you can start adding your personal touch and making medicine into an art because you feel you have mastered things. So layer 3, that is the full self-actualization that integrates the personal with a professional identity. So a professional identity, we know what that is, but everybody has a personal identity. So you need to integrate that. It requires a sense of mastery, skill to work in a context too, and autonomy to develop personal practice, preferences, habits, and convictions. And so layers 1 and 2 focus on meeting standards, and that's the difference between layer 3. In layers 1 and 2, students need to correct themselves all the time because there's standards from outside and they need to meet standards. They get feedback and they can correct themselves and until they meet the standards and everybody's satisfied. Now, layer 3 is totally different. There's not external standards to be set. We had a lot of discussion in our author team about this concept, but I'm convinced that what you need to do is have learners develop their own standards. And they can still develop, and they can go further and further. But they have met the basic standards that's enough for entrustment of healthcare practice. So some implications of that model. So resolving tensions between the need for standardization and contextualization, but also a space for individuality and diversity. If we look at the recent literature in medical education, there's a lot of literature about diversity. And how do we value that? How do we actually do that? So here in this model, we kind of reconcile the wish for diversity, but also the needs for standards. Then it's also reconciling the tension between the academic freedom of universities to educate students for whatever they want to be. And they're not the same. They're all different. And we value that as university. At the same time, healthcare asks at their door, are you meeting the standards that are necessary for patient care? So we need to reconcile that in some way. And taking this stepwise entrustment and the increase of legitimate autonomy seriously in the context of patient care, that is the implication, part of that implication of this model. And then valuing individuality and self-determination to foster the intrinsic motivation, I know Rashmi would say autonomous motivation, to develop, which in terms affects well-being and academic productivity. So we're doing that. And that is because what you want healthcare workers who really want to go. They're not afraid to go. They want to go tomorrow morning, 8 o'clock in a healthcare facility, relatively unfrightened by the unknown, just going ahead and doing things. That's what you want. So now a little looking forward, some blue sky prospection. And my disclaimer, of course, there's a sniff of wishful thinking in that too. So I'll talk a little bit about two things about canonical competence in layer 1, competence versus competition and artificial intelligence. And I'll talk a little bit about contextual competence, about EPAs and entrustment threshold, and about global contextual threats that we face now. And then about personalized competence, fostering self-determination, trust, and tolerance for diversity, and enabling progress in healthcare quality and tackling challenges. I'll come back to these things. So canonical competence, think of competence, and we know that those entering medical schools basically are already among the most bright students. They are among the brightest students, and we keep thinking about how can we optimize our selection procedure, but we have to realize also in the Netherlands, where people went through all the hurdles of secondary education and for university preparatory education, and then also with a narrow scape of topics that they had, most of them, I would say 90% would be really qualified to do that, and we cannot make easy differences between those. So what we can now see, and I'm actually happy what will happen in the coming period, and I can see it happening now, that grades in clinical education, why should we score people from 1 to 10 on a scale and say you are 7, you are an 8, and you are a 9, and we didn't observe you well enough, but some way, or it's a negotiation. We need to get rid of that. And it's gradually being replaced. And we see more and more schools in the United States, and it's also happening in the Netherlands. Those who follow the news may have recently acknowledged that cum laude qualifications are being abandoned. Free universities, starting with doing the other universities, are thinking about that too. In last year, the United States medical licensing exam, you had reported over 50 years, 70 years, I think, in grades, like in a scoring, in a very precise scoring. That score was being used by others to say, well, you are better than that student. They have abandoned that because they see that is dysfunctional. It doesn't work that way. And what we all want to do is get everybody to the standards that are important and not so much uh, create competition between students because that's the wrong culture that we're actually creating. So next steps in the future, and I just wonder whether that will happen. There is a United States, and those who are not familiar with the United States, an odd way to select for residency training. There are arguments, and there were probably good arguments 70 years ago, but now uh, people are questioning is the match procedure. And I can tell you what happens if you finish medical school, by you have good grades, you're qualified as a medical professional, and then in that usually happens in April for all students. July 1 is when everybody starts to go in residency training any place in the United States. You know why? How they actually accommodate that? They put everyone in a hat, in a big hat, and they draw like so. They have some criteria for that, but basically, I wouldn't. If I would say it's a lottery procedure, I'm sure people will say, "Well, that's not the truth." But what they do is actually they block the whole idea that there could be a variable training period. So if you don't do that, you're out. Actually, one of our PhD students from San Francisco, we had a discussion just a few days ago about why are we actually doing that, and say, well, you're not satisfactory. And also, I would say, and those Canadians who are in the audience or actually listening to this, rethink the competence by design model, because I do think it doesn't really comply with competency-based education. Is there a reason to rethink your model? Then at canonical competence, we have to also think of things that come to us. Artificial intelligence, that's a huge issue for educators. And basically, we have to really question the epistemology. So the epistemic of what is medical knowledge? What is required medical knowledge? We've been always thinking that we can define that well. Now with AI tools, we will probably within a few years have to rethink what are the knowledge and skills that every physician should have. Is that all memorized knowledge in their head because they are supposed to be doing this without any tools? Or are those tools instantly available whenever you do something with patient care? So we have to really think about that. And there is an evolutionary law. Some people are a little bit afraid of that. But if we have those tools, relevant knowledge will only stick if we need it and use it. So if we keep training students to memorize things, but in practice they will not use it. If we keep training to individuals to remember their geography, then we give in a navigator, they will kind of quickly use their way around if they drive a car, because we all have navigators to actually taking over that function that our memory used to be doing. And I would say there's a good reason to think why educators should take the lead in this whole process. Just this month, a paper in the New England Journal of Medicine, and well, this is the top journal in our whole medical field. Actually, there is a call for specifically for educators with a dual purpose, not only to adapt educational methods, but also to serve the future of healthcare. And what they say, educators should take the lead here. Then contextual competence. Programs and entrustments decision making must be taken seriously. Educators must find a way to create progressive autonomy. You know, for those who think, well, why we're not doing that, there is a big patient safety movement, and say, well, if a patient goes to a teaching hospital, they should not be treated by a resident in training, because a specialist can do that better. Just think of this whole paradigm. If you would actually do that, how would those specialists ever get that level that they're supposed to be doing this? So working with EPAs, units of practice that you can oversee that are not too big, and that you get, so you are ready to do this. So programs must find ways to create that progressive autonomy. And when entrustment ratings, and I've seen that happen too often, people say, we're doing with EPAs and we're working entrustment rating. Here's a form, you just fill it out. And where does this person score? Ready for unsupervised practice? Okay, they're done. But then nothing happens for that person. So that's not a true entrustment decision. A true entrustment decision means you're now allowed to do something in healthcare. Otherwise, bureaucracy and textbook culture will result. And we start seeing that now. So be brave. So grant autonomy once sufficient competence is validly demonstrated. Of course, you have to do that very well. But if you're sure, why not do that? And why wait until the end of training? Why would you say to a student who passed their driver's exam, you passed your exam, so we won't give you a license until a year from now, because why would you postpone that, actually? So we're doing that in healthcare all the time. We suggest that you're ready for it, but will not let you be autonomous. So would I trust or would I trust? It was kind of funny that Beard actually also referred to that paper. Would I trust or will I trust? It is really the critical question. And then the layer two is we have contexts are under threat because we see things coming upon us. The pandemic, we have seen that has had huge impacts on education too, healthcare education, but also climate change, warfare, migration, all those elements we need to take into account in the future of healthcare. And we need adaptation to different contexts and changes in existing contexts, and that requires flexibility. Healthcare and education are becoming global enterprise, so we can't solve that on our own. We have to fight those threats with concerted international efforts. And healthcare workforces must be trained to be flexible, and using EPAs might help somewhat. And just give one example, and Inge Pol has alluded to that in her talk, actually. This is an example of what happens right now in the Netherlands. All of postgraduate nursing training is completely revamped. We used to have parallel programs for all those specialties in nursing. Now what we do is say, we offer you a whole set of EPAs. And what we're doing, and of course there must be some regulation, is that, but you're building your portfolio with EPAs that are needed or that you would want. So we're serving that flexibility serves both the enhanced career perspectives and those who are familiar with the news. We have a big problem with nursing leaving their profession. We need them. We need more of them. So enhanced career perspective and also adaptation to healthcare needs. We've seen in the pandemic period, suddenly was such a call and interest in this project that we were preparing. So personalized competence, fostering self-determination, trust and tolerance for diversity. That theory is brilliant theory. So self-determination theory, satisfaction of the needs of autonomy, competence, and relatedness that fosters intrinsic motivation or autonomous motivation, and then well-being and productivity. And we need that. So then just combine those two things. I talked about self-actualization in that pyramid of Maslow, remember? And self-determination. That is exceeding the external standards of competence, and that is needed to optimize our satisfaction. We want satisfied healthcare workers, not those who are just fighting to meet the regular standards. So schools of health professions education and healthcare institutions must adapt to these needs, also to decrease burnout and attrition and to remain attractive as a domain of work. And then finally, diversity among students. Students are not the same when they enter medical school. They have a whole parasivine before they start in medical school. They are all different. So all must be brought up to standards, but their parasivine will make them physicians with a unique personal identity. So trust and tolerance and respect among teachers and learners and colleagues, valuing individual differences, only that will create coherent teams in healthcare. So we have to attend to that. And finally, it's good to think about how do we improve healthcare, enabling progress in healthcare quality and tackling challenges. Just think of those, and those experienced may recognize that in themselves, who have mastered the relevant canon of knowledge and skills, and also have the ability to practice in variable contexts, then can feel free to add to the quality of healthcare by optimizing their own knowledge and skills, initiating healthcare quality improvements, bringing clinical practice to new heights and tackling some of the huge challenges that I talked about that healthcare faces. And I would add, relatively unfrightened by the unknown. So that was actually that talk, and I wanted to end it with a few personal things, not very long. So I'm very, very grateful. Also, have been grateful to contribute to the development of health professions education and also internationally, and I will be keeping doing that now. So we have that international online course, which actually is very, very popular, and we'll keep doing that in the coming years, multiple times per year. I've been working, and I currently actually work for an American organization called FAMER, who is also his mission is to improve healthcare in all countries, specifically in the less developed countries. And together with that, also many studies, publications, presentations, and still PhD supervision will be doing that. And there's plenty of non-professional things also going on. So thank you, audience, very much for being here, and all friends and colleagues whom I was fortunate to collaborate with across many, many years. Thank you. Bernd, what do we do? You take the lead. Do you want me to take? What shall we do? Okay.